One thing that I've always tried to just remember is the most important relationship in my life is my relationship with God. It's not my wife. My relationship with God is first. My wife is second. And I am the same for her. The most important relationship in her life is God. I don't want to be the ultimate thing in her life. I want God to be the ultimate thing in her life. If your relationship with God is solid, then your relationship with your wife or your girlfriend is going to be the best it can ever be.
I keep asking myself, why have my relationships been failing? Why haven't I been the man that I want to be? And it's because I get so close to the line without trying to cross it, when in reality, I should be trying to move the line as far away from me as possible.
The same goes when you're single. I think because something early on when I was single, I wasn't saved. All these things I wish I had somebody speaking this truth into my life when I was that young, and I didn't, so I found out the hard way.
One of the things that you mentioned about Joseph, one of the things that I love about that story is when Potiphar's wife first starts trying to put herself on him, he refuses to look. How many times in my life would I benefit from when I'm on my phone on social media and something comes up and I'm tempted to just not even look at it, to just shut off my phone, throw it across the room, and do what Joseph did and just book it out of there.
But even when you're single, I had this view of like, well, it's not adultery because she's not married either, right? I'm not married, she's not married, it's not adultery. And it's like, no, sex before marriage is adultery because that is not your wife.
Right.
That is going to be someone else's wife. I think it's important to set those boundaries even when you're single. Have situations where if you're dating, like don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to be alone with your girlfriend on a couch in the dark.
Welcome back to the Centered Podcast. My name is Garth, and I'm super excited to have Mr. Hummel here. And today, we're going to be talking a lot about what you've been doing and a lot about your life experience. And you've been doing something called The All-In Husband, which is on YouTube. And it is specifically geared towards husbands to teach them about what it looks like to put God in the center of your marriage. And you have been such an inspiration to me, and you've been such an inspiration, I know, to other people. You've been a father figure to some of my best friends, and you've been such a great role model for us. And so first and foremost, I'm just so excited that you're on this morning. Awesome. And I appreciate you taking the time coming on. And you're all the way here from Texas.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it.
Man, no, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. I've watched the podcast. I love to see it, and this is very cool to actually be here. And so, thanks for having me.
Of course.
But yeah, from Austin, Texas, and The All-In Husband is really it's a podcast that I kind of started with, not really knowing what I wanted it to be, whether I wanted to be a podcast or just something I would write. And it's all about equipping, challenging, and encouraging husbands to be all in their relationship with God and their wives. But then I also kind of want it to be more, I want people to get things out of it that even if they're not married, right? So singles, people that are wanting to get married, that people that have been divorced, I want to be able to help kind of all people. Yeah,
you've helped. I can attribute to that. You've helped me, and I'm a young single man, and you've helped me for the last year of just encouragement and leading me in a way that's better and showing me a way that's better versus myself, and I just really appreciate it. And so once again, I'm happy you're here, and I really appreciate The All-In Husband. I've watched it too, and I'll leave the link in the description for everyone that's listening and watching to go check that out, because it's awesome, and I really appreciate all the things that you do with that. One thing that you've said that I really love is one of the things that we should be doing as husbands, and even in my situation when I get in a relationship as a boyfriend, is loving selflessly, but in your case, loving selflessly in marriage. And so I would love to just touch a little bit more on what the All-In Husband is really about, and like specific things that you have teached or taught in the All-In Husband that you just love and passionate about.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly the way that it all started was, again, so I've been, my wife and I just celebrated 20 years of marriage this last October.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. We've been, we started dating when I was 17 years old, and neither one of us were saved at the time. So I've been with her longer than I've been without her.
It's a dream.
It really is. It's been an incredible journey. But like starting out, the first year was really good, of marriage, and then it kind of tapered off from there. The first 6 years weren't really great, right? So we even got to the point of talking about divorce. And all of that was, I've got a long history of depression and suicidal thoughts and things of that nature. And so that definitely played into my marriage. And we can, actually, there's a video about my testimony, so I won't go into too much of that, but a little bit more about that as well. But it really got to a point where I was living so selfishly. It was all about me. It was about what can I get out of this? She's not making me happy. I'm looking at her. I'm putting these heavy expectations on her that she's supposed to make me happy, when that's not how God designed marriage. God designed marriage to make us holy, not happy. And so it got to a point where, we were talking about divorce. We had 2 young kids. We weren't planning on having any more. And my wife and I both got saved about a month apart from each other back in '09.
Wow.
And that completely changed our marriage. So I've seen God restore our marriage. I've seen God really help us not just to survive, but to thrive. And since then, we've had 2 more kids. We've, again, celebrated 20 years. And so it's been pretty incredible with that. But aside from that, the way God has used us is to be able to help in various marriage ministries, to lead in marriage ministries, to serve in marriage ministries, to come alongside married couples, and to learn about what are couples struggling with in marriage. And so many people think I'm the only one going through this, right? They think I'm too embarrassed to share our marriage struggles because this is just us, when in reality they're very common. And I think if we talk about these things, we can encourage one another. I'd love for people to learn about my mistakes so that they don't make them themselves, right? So it's so that's just what drove me to do all that. And it's been pretty crazy.
I love it. And I mean, there's so much wisdom there, man. It's really encouraging for me, because I've come from a past of relationships to where I've really just taken it for myself and have really just lived selfishly and not selflessly. And you can see where I'm at with that right now, and it's a harsh reality, and it's hard lessons that I've had to learn, but I know that these are lessons that some people just have to learn the hard way. And when you really do put God in the center of your life and what you do, things just they honestly work out for the better. And even though it doesn't seem like it in the moment, there's so many times in my life where I look at a situation and I say, how can I address this myself, and what feels the best and what seems right, like what you mentioned about being happy over being holy. And it's all about, what do I think is best? And when I actually put God first into a situation, and I say, not what would I do, but what would God want me to do in this situation, it usually turns out for the better, which is obvious, but it's honestly harder than you would expect.
Well, because even when you know what God wants us to do, that's not always the easiest route, right? So even, living selflessly in marriage, I mean, early on, where we had our struggles, we were married. I was working full time. I'd go to work, and after work, I'd go party. I lived like I was single. I thought that as long as I came home every night, as long as I put food on the table, that I was doing my job as a husband, I was doing my job as a father. In reality, my wife and my kids weren't a priority. It was about me. It was about, I want to have fun. I want to be happy. I deserve this. I should be able to go do this because I work hard. I should be able to buy what I want. I should be able to go do what I want. And then just how that switches, like the other way around. And that's a lot of times in marriage. People live in marriage in a contractual relationship where I'm not going to do this because she didn't do this for me. I don't want to do this because she doesn't do this. When in reality, it's such an amazing, beautiful thing when you flip that script a bit and you're living selflessly for one another. My concern is her. I know that I'm not responsible for her salvation, but I am, as a spiritual leader of the house, responsible to be concerned for her walk. To encourage her, to ask how her prayer life is going. And we're doing we do devotionals together, pray together, and things like that. But it's like, my concern is always her. I've always put her and the kids in the nicest cars we've had, and I've driven the jalopies, right? It's as a small example, but little things like my concern is, how is she doing? Is she good? Is she happy? Is she healthy? Even if that means that I sacrifice things, and because that's what Jesus modeled for us, right? Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve. And when you approach relationships like that, when you're both living selflessly for one another, it works. It's a beautiful thing. And so it's just, I wish more couples could experience that, dating and marriage.
And see, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is all of that right there is not only, I'm sure, beneficial to everyone listening, but also you're helping me with understanding how to become a great husband or a great father one day. One thing that I've learned the hard way is that you can't just say something and expect something to happen.
Right.
You need to put in the work and you need to put in the action to actually see that thing be fruitful. And one thing that I've been saying for years is I can't wait to be a husband and a father.
Yeah.
But I've had to look at my own life and ask myself, Garth, how have you actually been preparing yourself for that? Like, have you actually been doing the things that you should be doing to equip yourself for that? Have you been, not even spiritually, but mentally, financially, how am I spending my time? Where am I spending my money? It's, am I being immature in my walk with Christ in some area to where it's not going to benefit my future wife or my future kids? And I know that I'm not going to be perfect before I get married, and I know that I'm not going to have a perfect marriage because there is no such thing as a perfect marriage, and I learned that from you. But I think that there's a level of, I would just use that as a crutch to, or I would, not even a crutch, but I would just say that just for the sake of saying it. But I wouldn't honestly truly want to prepare myself for that.
Yeah.
And so I think that one of the things that you have, actually before I move on, I wanted to touch a little bit on when you mentioned your wife and your kids. You said this to me the other day, which really struck me, and it was the ranking of God and your wife and your kids and everything else in life, and how the world ranks these things versus how we as men of God should be ranking these things. And I'd love for you to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's something I think God's definitely taught me over the years. We see a lot of examples of our kids as we get older. We have families. Our kids tend to run our lives with sports and school and everything else, where it's very easy for us to kind of put our relationships on the back burner because that's our focus. Our kids can become idols, right? When anything takes the place of God on that throne, they become the most important thing. That's an idol. Our kids can become idols. I've seen relationships not go well because the kids were more important to them or a bigger priority than their marriage. And any spouse, husband or wife, that feels like they're not a priority over their kids, that's not going to go well. So one thing that I've always tried to just remember is the most important relationship in my life is my relationship with God. It's not my wife. My relationship with God is first. My wife is second. And I am the same for her. The most important relationship in her life is God. I don't want to be the ultimate thing in her life. I want God to be the ultimate thing in her life, because then, like, if your relationship with God is solid, then your relationship with your wife or your girlfriend is going to be the best it can ever be. And if your relationship with your spouse is good, your kids are going to see that. Your kids are going to feel that. Your kids are going to feel that warmth and love and joy in the house and see what a godly marriage should look like. And so I think that's where a lot of times where we go wrong is we have the best of intentions, but we'll put that relationship with a girlfriend or a wife, put that up on the pedestal, and that becomes our focus, and we take our eyes off God. Right? And so
that's exactly what I've done.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because the intentions are there, but it gets away very quickly. Because then if you're not, I notice any time that my wife, and again, as you mentioned, there are no perfect marriages, right? There's some really good ones, but they take a lot of work. They didn't happen overnight. And even all these things that God's taught me over the years in marriage, I still don't have a perfect marriage, right? We still struggle because we're sinful, right? We're fallen human beings. We're trying our best to follow Jesus and to love our spouse well. But I notice the times that if my wife and I aren't, and we don't have, I don't know, we don't fight a whole lot, right? We have disagreements, which is different, right? I think there's a lot of times marriages can get into yelling matches, screaming matches, and things like that, and that's never been who we are, right? We don't want that for our family. But when we do have disagreements, when I can tell when my wife and I are not jiving, it's because I've not been in the Word. It's because my prayer life has been lacking. It's because my relationship with God is just in a valley. I'm struggling and for whatever way. And even after, as long as we've been married, as long as I've been following Christ, I still have those valleys. I'm not, I struggle with, case of the blues every now and then, not full depression like I used to, but I know I can sense when, I feel like her and I aren't clicking. the root of it is, man, I haven't prayed in days. I haven't even opened my Bible in days.
Wow.
Like it's a real struggle. I'm not here to say like, oh, I've got all this figured out. No, man, this is still a daily struggle for me and for I think everybody.
And wow, first of all, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
The first thing that I thought of when you were saying that was kind of going back to the whole taking action and doing something versus just saying something. And I think that I've also said in my own life, I want God to be the center of my relationship, and that I want God to be the forefront of my mind through all of it. When I look at my own life, it's how often do I actually put God on the back burner when I say I don't want to do that, but I still do. And it's just it's a matter of lying to myself, of saying I want this, but I'm doing the complete opposite. And I was thinking about this morning as I was preparing, and one of the things that came to mind was the definition of, it wasn't a psychopath, but it was
Like a narcissist? Or what?
a crazy person.
Okay, yeah.
Someone, but I can't remember the actual term. I apologize. The actual term, however, it's something along the lines of, it's a crazy person, and the definition of it is you're doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
Yep.
And that's how I've done a lot of my life, is certain areas of my life I've done the same thing, expecting something different, and it doesn't turn out, out different. And so I've had to really look in the mirror and say, okay, what do I need to do to change? What do I actually have to do to fix this? And what God has really been showing me, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the very end of what God's been showing us, but what God's been showing me is, honestly, Garth, you need to be quiet and you need to just do something. And you need to stop expecting to figure it out and have an understanding of everything, and you just need to take some steps, and you need to be moving. And I've honestly seen him work a lot in that. And one thing that I do want to touch on real quick is, what does putting God first look like in our own lives? And what are some practical ways that we individually put God first in our own lives? You mentioned going into the Word and praying. Are there any other ways that you put God first in your life? Or
I think, and again, not something that I'm, like, not something I've got figured out at all, but it's something I'm literally, I do try to do is, again, running everything through that filter, right? Is this something that God would have me do? And also setting boundaries, right? Setting boundaries, not just with, we can talk about this as well, but I think I'll get to this in a second, but setting boundaries with just things in your life, right? The Bible talks about, if your left eye causes you to sin, rip it out, right? It's better to enter the kingdom missing an eye, right? And if your left hand causes you to sin, cut it off. And I don't suggest taking that literally, but identifying those things in your life that could cause you to stumble, those things in your life that could cause you to sin. For me, a big one is social media, which is hard. Like, I'm trying to do a podcast, trying to be on Instagram. There's so much garbage out there that whether you're looking for it or not is just right in front of you.
Yep.
So I go through these spurts of deleting Instagram because there's things on there that are tempting.
Yeah.
Right? So I would rather not have it than that cause me to sin. Right? And so just trying to do things like that are going to be glorifying to God in our daily lives. And I think that means even setting boundaries when you're dating, setting boundaries when you're married. I think when you're dating, I think that this rule goes for both, right? It's going to have different effects based on your relationship, but setting boundaries with women, right? So I'm in the corporate world where I had a job where I was leading a bunch of people. Half of my team was women, right? And so whenever I would have meetings with them, if I'd have a one-on-one meeting, I would either go into the conference room that had glass so everyone can see, or if it was in my office, I'd leave the door open. I don't put myself in a situation where I'm going to be alone with a woman, right? Even if I know nothing's going to happen, right? I don't want that temptation. I don't know. And it's my wife and I are doing a Devo right now about the life of Joseph, and a couple days ago talked about Potiphar's wife.
Oh, dude, I love this story.
Isn't that crazy? And so she's coming on him several times, and he's turning her down. the one time when she grabs his cloak and he runs off, it says like they're alone together. Like they're alone in a room together. There's no one else around. But he does the best thing. He runs.
Yep.
And that's like, man, I'm like, if you're in a situation where you're about to sin, run.
Yep.
That's because even you know, you don't want to sin like that. You don't want to sin against God in your relationship, in your marriage. The same goes when you're single. I think because something early on when I was single, I wasn't saved. All these things I wish I had somebody speaking this truth into my life when I was that young, and I didn't. So I found out the hard way. But even when you're single, I had this view of like, well, it's not adultery because she's not married either, right? I'm not married, she's not married, it's not adultery. And it's like, no, sex before marriage is adultery because that is not your wife.
Right.
That is going to be someone else's wife. And so I think it's important to set those boundaries even when you're single. So have situations where if you're dating, like don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to be alone with your girlfriend on a couch in the dark.
Yep.
You know, and so have other people around. And it's like there's, you know, I don't know. I think that's helpful whether you're single or you're married, and it's a good, I think, rule of life of just identifying those things in your life that could tempt you to sin, and just removing those situations. Right. The best way to not make a mistake is to make it impossible to make a mistake, and that is running through that filter of is this pleasing and glorifying to God, and if it's not, I don't want it.
If I'm to be completely honest with you, that's something that I've struggled with in my life. And I keep asking myself, why have my relationships been failing? Why haven't I been the man that I want to be? And it's because I get so close to the line without trying to cross it, when in reality I should be trying to move the line as far away from me as possible. And one of the things that you mentioned about Joseph, one of the things that I love about that story is something that's really interesting when you read that story is when Potiphar's wife first starts trying to put herself on him, he refuses to look. And so how many times in my life would I benefit from when I'm on my phone on social media and something comes up and I'm tempted to just not even look at it, to just shut off my phone, throw it across the room and do what Joseph did and just book it out of there. And you know, I don't know why that can be so hard sometimes of not wanting to do that. And it kind of goes back to the whole thing we were talking about doing God's way. Is God's way is harder in the moment, but it's so much more fruitful in the end. And just the fact that, you know, if we look at the what ifs with Joseph, if Joseph did sleep with Potiphar's wife, he would have been killed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the fact that he didn't and he ran, sure, he was imprisoned, but he eventually came to rule over all of Egypt, just right under Pharaoh. So I just think it's amazing.
Well, and even if you look at like what was his response to Potiphar's wife? He says, how could I do this egregious sin towards God? He's looking at this as, if I do this, I don't think his concern was dying. His concern was sinning against God. And I think, and if we look at that in a way of again, even just little boundaries, like with, you don't, even if you're not looking for it, right? Not even on your phone, not social media. You're walking down the street, right? We live in a day and age where it's all about, I think people want to be seen. People want to be noticed.
Sure.
People dress ways that are I would say not modest, right? To put it nicely, not very modest.
100%.
So I have a rule of, like, when I'm walking, I get very, like, I have a lot of squirrel moments, right? Something walks by, I look just because it's there.
Hello, squirrel.
Yeah, every single time. It's probably happened several times in this conversation too. But I have these squirrel moments where if something walks by, I have to look, and not on purpose, but then I notice if it's a female, I have a rule: don't look twice, don't look back, like run that way. Because if I look by, just see people walking, I'm a people watcher. But I think where we can fall into temptation, fall into sin, is where when a pretty girl walks by and we go, oh, hey.
Yeah.
Right? The Bible says, you know, if you look at a woman with lustful intent, you've already committed adultery in your heart, right?
Yep.
That's the same to God as it is if you actually did it, right? And then also, too, just to have this thought, and I have this thought as well, is like, that's somebody's wife.
Yeah.
That's somebody's daughter. I don't want anybody looking at my wife that way, or my daughter that way, my daughters that way. And so I think that's just it's a helpful tool. Again, be like Joseph, run.
Yeah. And what I think is cool is by you living this way, you are leading other people, including myself and a bunch of other guys and girls. Like, you're leading us in a way that is so encouraging and uplifting, and I know that honors God. And so I really appreciate the way that you've been talking about these things, and the way that I can hear your passion, and I can see that you actively try to live this out. And I think that is another thing that is really important for people to realize who are walking in the faith, is trying to do it and not being perfect. I think one of my best friends, way too hard on herself when she falls short.
Yeah.
And it's the actual desire to be better and to try and do it God's way. That's the Holy Spirit. And that means that God's working on you, and that's good news. That's something to be celebrated. And Jesus doesn't want us to fall short and then turn away from him. He wants us to fall short and turn to him, because he knows we're going to fall short.
Right.
So where are we going to turn when we do that? And one thing that I did want to point out, which is, I love what you said about the whole business and not being in a room with a girl just by yourself. I think that the business world needs to grow some brains, because that is so true. And that's actually something that I do on this podcast, is you will never see me I haven't had a lot of female guests on the podcast. One of them actually is your daughter. And
that's right. Yeah.
One of my rules is I will never have a podcast episode with a girl, just the two of us.
Yeah.
And so when I had Alexis on, Hudson was on the couch.
Yeah.
And so
Love that.
I think that is something that a lot of people just need, that reminder. And something that we should be talking about more is, if you're in business or if you're just in life in general, don't be alone with a girl, whether that's in the car, whether that's, like you said, on the couch in the dark. Just be wise about what you're doing. And
well, because when you look at it this way too, even like in the workplace, you see a lot of times affairs happen at work, right? Affairs don't always start. No, I'll say this. I would say 99% of the time, affairs do not start out as sexual affairs. They start out as emotional affairs. It starts out about, there's a girl at work that you become friends with. Great. But you start sharing things about your wife. You start complaining about struggles in your marriage. That is where that completely goes south. Don't ever vent to anybody about your wife, right? If you're especially a female, right? If you have an issue with your girlfriend, don't confide in another female for that.
Yep.
That is such a bad idea, right?
Yep.
That's where, I think that's another.
Yeah, and us men need to be held responsible for that.
100%.
And I had this thought right just now of saying, same thing with girls, but then I had this other thought that was in my head. You know what? We can say, oh, girls need to do this as well, but you know what? We're men, and we need to be leading by example, and we can't just be pushing blame on the females as well and
100%.
women as well, being like, you need to do this as well. It's no, I'm actually going to lead by example, and I'm going to do this because I know it's right, not because she's also doing it, but because I need to be doing this. And what's interesting is when we start putting God first in our lives, the enemy starts attacking us. And I know that you've experienced this firsthand, and I've experienced this firsthand as well. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about what you told me about what happens when you start prioritizing God.
Yeah. Well, excuse me. No, so we kind of talked about the other day was even like this, the all-in husband, right? This is something that I don't know that I started doing because again, as a man, like one of the passions that God's put on my heart is men's ministry and marriage ministry because of my past, my history. And so the way God's been using me is to disciple men one-on-one, right? Is to lead in marriage ministry and do things like that, start this podcast. And the interesting thing about that is the moment you start doing that, the moment you step out in faith and you start doing something for the advancement of the kingdom or for the gospel, you are putting a target on your back. If the thing that the enemy wants the most for us is for us to be idle, right? Because if we're not being effective for the kingdom, we're not a threat. Right, we're not a threat. But the moment you start doing things like that, you're putting a target on your back, which we need to, I think, expect. I think that's where it gets really hard is when we're not expecting it, and we should expect it. But we also know that God is with us, and God is more powerful, God is stronger, right? So I haven't actually posted an episode on the podcast in a couple of months, and this honestly has got me fired up to get back out there. I've got a couple that I want to do.
Come on, man.
Yeah, I need to, but I think where what I kind of alluded to earlier was when I realized when I'm not doing well, when I don't feel, I'll say this too, when I don't feel close to God, right? And I preface that by saying it's never, God's not far away. It's us, right? It's us that can get far from God. He's always there. He never leaves, right? So, but when I feel far from God, my marriage starts to struggle, right? And I realized that as soon as I started doing this podcast, encouraging, challenging, equipping husbands to be all in their walk with God and with their wife, that's putting a target on my back. And so the last couple of months, I'd been struggling with in case of the blues, right? Yeah. I've been struggling a little bit with depression, and my wife, she's so sweet. She said something meaning absolutely nothing, and I took it the completely wrong way. And rather than talk to her about it, I let it fester, and I became upset. And this is, again, I've been married for 20 years, and this still happens, right? So no one's immune.
Right.
But kind of what we talked about the other day too is I think the biggest struggles that I've recognized that people have in marriage is expectations and communication, right?
True.
We set these unrealistic expectations on our spouse, and then when they don't meet those expectations, we get upset. Then when we don't communicate with our spouse, nothing good can come of that. So that's where I think where I've kind of been hit with that lately is trying to work on marriages, trying to help people with their marriage. My marriage is getting attacked, right? And so recognizing that, preparing for that, and again, I think just recognizing that that's there.
Yeah, 100%. I can relate to that, not to the marriage part of that, but to the being attacked by the enemy when it comes to doing something that is trying to honor God and further his kingdom. This podcast, for example, when I started doing this podcast, and it was great to start out, but over time I started realizing that I would get anxious a lot, and I couldn't pinpoint it, and I somehow was tricked into believing that the anxiety was coming from God, which led me further away from God, which brought even more anxiety on.
Yeah.
And I mean, I got to give kudos to the enemy for that, because I mean, that was a trick that just kept on tricking.
Yeah.
I didn't see it, and I firmly believed in a false reality, and that has set me on a course of really renewing my mind and really furthering my mindset in the best way, which honestly I've heard this saying a lot of the times, that whatever the enemy uses for harm, God uses for good.
Oh yeah.
And I never really understood that until recently, to where I look back the last year, 6 months to a year, and I see where I was so flustered, so easily swayed back and forth to different realities, different ideas, different beliefs. I was so easily tossed around by the world and by my own mind, that I look back now and I just see that a lot of what I went through, God really used to shape me into who I am sitting here right now.
Sure.
Which is really exciting, just because I'm so rooted and so firm in what I believe now. And so now for me, I'm not going to be easily swayed like I was before. And that's a really cool reality, but I say that to the point of acknowledging that when the enemy attacks, it's going to suck. And it's a reality that we have to expect, and we can't just expect it not to happen, because that's just lying to ourselves. It's going to happen when you start putting God first and when you start prioritizing him. But the good news is like what you were saying, is that God's more powerful, right, and that God will use what the enemy uses for harm for good. Yeah. And I have seen that in my own life, and I have honestly come out stronger because of what God's done. And it's not anything from me. You know, I can take the necessary steps, like taking action steps and actually doing something instead of just letting it hit me. I can actually do something about it. But the reality is, I can try and give myself credit all I want, but the reality is that God is doing far more than I can imagine behind the scenes that I don't see. And it would be selfish of me to give myself all the credit of furthering my mind and making me better. I know that He is the reason to why I'm at where I'm at today.
Well, and I love to see that too. That you're continuing to grow in sanctification, right? That's, I think, the big comfort for me is that sanctification is a process, right?
True.
We're not going to arrive this side of heaven, right? So I think as long as we can look back, again, my goal is always to look back and go, am I closer to God today than I was this time last year, right? I'm never going to be perfect. I'm gonna fall. I'm gonna stumble. But as long as I'm repenting, I'm going to God, and I'm trying to further my relationship with Him every day. That's all you can ask for, right?
Right.
As long as you're further along in your walk today than you were this time last year.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And one of the most encouraging things that you can hear from someone is when they see that in you, when you don't even see it in yourself, because change is so slow, and you don't see it. It's just little by little. Yeah. And then when you see someone you haven't seen in a while, and they tell you that, hey,
you're different. Yeah.
Yeah. You seem different, or you are different. Yeah. That's such an encouragement, because you don't see it at all.
Yeah.
You still, we are our own worst critic. And that's so true today. Kind of going back on topic of dating, man, first of all, this conversation has been amazing. And I just want to thank you again for coming on. I really appreciate it. This has been really awesome. Are you sure you're good with the sun and everything? I'm happy to move. Okay.
I'm good. Yeah.
I just want to make sure. So one last thing that I wanted to touch on is the dating world today.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about marriage. We've talked a lot about putting God first. We've talked a lot about what that looks like. But now kind of speaking to the singles.
Right.
And speaking to what the dating world is like versus what it should be and what God wants it to be. I would love to speak on that a little bit. And so the first thing I have here that we talked about is the struggles that we face as young Christian men. Now, for me, I mean, already through this conversation, you can already pinpoint so many things that young Christian men, including myself, struggle with. Whether that's temptation, whether that's your mindset, whether that's anxiety, whatever it is. These are all things that we struggle with. And I would just want to say to the point that even though you struggle with it, that doesn't cling to your identity.
Right. And
the things that you struggle with and the mistakes that you make, they're not linked to your value.
Right.
And what your value is not what you can produce, and it's not what you do, but it's how God sees you. And that's something that I've had to learn as well over the last 6 months is what does this, and the reason why I keep saying the last 6 months is because the last 6 months I've been forced into a lot of change and a lot of really just understanding my mind and my life and who God is and how He sees me. And it's been a really big wake-up call, and which has been a huge blessing in disguise for sure.
Yeah.
And so talking about that and going into that, I think I got caught up in a lot of, I'm this way, so I need to change myself to be of more value. But the reality is when I was in my lowest of lows, I was still incredibly valuable in God's eyes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of young Christian men, but also young Christian women need to hear too.
Yeah, agreed.
And also non-Christians.
Yeah.
You are all valued by God. You are all loved by God. And that's a truth that we need to cling to and really just trying to understand how God sees us. Could you explain a little bit? Could you explain your understanding as well of how God sees us?
Yeah.
That way, that could be an encouragement to me as well as everyone listening and watching.
No, for sure. And I love that too because the Bible says God created us in His image, right? He loves us no matter what. Like He doesn't. I think to your earlier point you had made, where facing anxieties or just these thoughts of your worth and your value, it's important to recognize that those thoughts are not from God. Mm-hmm. Those thoughts, that is the enemy. Like that, those thoughts, you need to take those captive and to have. I've got a buddy of mine that that I'm super close with. He's an accountability partner, and I'll share things with him. And he's like, "Bro, like that's not from God." And I'm like, I know. And so I think it's recognizing that there's nothing that we can do, right, to earn our salvation. First off, right, Jesus did that for us on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, there's nothing that we need to do. We can't earn our salvation, right? There's nothing we need to do in that sense. But the fact, our response to that should be wanting to do good works, wanting to serve God. And so, God's, I think, image of us doesn't change, right? When we sin, right? When we sin and then we repent and we come back to God, He doesn't hold that over our heads, right? He doesn't. I used to have this sweatshirt that said, "The next time the devil reminds you of your past, remind him of his future."
I love
Revelation
that.
2010, and so I think any of those times that we have that guilt and shame over past sin. Someone once told me, they said, if God's already forgiven you of that sin, why do you keep bringing it up? Right? That's in the past. God doesn't see that, right? And so,
Yep.
I think it's just important to recognize that we are loved by God. We are created in His image. We are important to Him. We are special to Him, and that's just an incredible thought that I don't think we really think about too often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that so much, and there's so much deeper. There's such a deeper understanding behind that we are created in God's image. I feel like that is. Not I feel like. I know that is a term that a lot of people hear today from a lot of Christians, and as Christians we hear it all the time. But it's like, what does that actually look like? What does that mean?
Yeah.
And there's such a rich understanding of that. And I love what you said about you've sinned in the past, why keep bringing it up? That's something that I struggle with, but let's be honest, that's something that everyone struggles with.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's okay to struggle with that because I know that God is not looking at you and He's getting upset at you because you keep bringing it up. If anything, He's reminding you, and He is trying to get you to understand that, hey, I don't see this anymore.
Right.
I saw this funny video a couple months ago. Actually, this was almost like 8 months ago, and it was of this guy who was making Christian content, and he was acting as God and himself, and he was going to God and he was saying, hey, I did this thing, please forgive me. And God's like, oh, yep, I forgive you. And the guy was like, well, are you sure? I mean, it was really bad. And God was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, my sin that I just mentioned. He was like, wait, what sin?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, this sin. It's like, oh, okay, well, I forgive you. It's like, great. And it's just, it was a funny video, but honestly, it was so much truth in that of just God forgets it completely. So why do we keep remembering it? And, to be completely honest with you, when I think about my future wife, when I think about how I want to be looking at her, I want to be looking at her the way that God sees her. Yeah. And I don't want to be looking at her remembering the past of what she's done or vice versa. I don't want her looking at my past and saying, I can't believe he did this. I want to be looking at each other and seeing each other more of how God sees us versus how we want to see us, and how the world will say, hold that against your partner, have them, they need to apologize, and that's always going to be attached to them. For God, He doesn't see that, and that's really what I want, and that's the kind of I hear a lot of people say, God, give me your eyes and give me your ears, so that way I can understand, that way I can see more of what you see, and really act how you want me to act. And that's honestly my heart behind that, and I'm striving for that, and that's what I want.
Well, so I think even in those cases too, where you do have those memories of past sin, right? I try to look at. I think God definitely uses those in a way that, for me, it's not to guilt me, but I remember that time I did this. I go, the fact that God forgave me of that, how could I not forgive her of this?
Yep.
Right. Of like Ephesians 4:32. Right. Be kind and tenderhearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Right. It's a reminder that God forgave us of this. We should be forgiving other people of that.
I love that.
And I think, and again, my wife and I weren't saved at the time we got married. So I'm thankful that you have a relationship with God, that you are walking with Him, and that is your desire for your future wife, because I wish we would have had that. Our marriage would have been, I don't want to say easier, because it's never, it's not easier just because you're following God. I think in most cases it's harder.
Yeah.
But we didn't have hope, right? When you're walking with Christ, you have hope, and we didn't have that. But I wish somebody would have told me these things years ago. In the sense that I love the idea of praying for your future spouse, right? Even though you don't have that person out there yet, praying that God would be one preparing you in your walk, that your walk with Him would be solid and growing, but then also too that future wife of yours, that whoever that is, that God is doing the same thing for her, right? And just again praying for that future spouse.
Yeah, that's one thing that I want to get better at.
Yeah,
for sure. That's something that I've heard a lot of my mentors and a lot of my favorite pastors talk about is praying for your future spouse, whether you know who that is or whether you don't. And it's just the reality, and it's preparing your heart, like you said, and it's really inviting God in before it even starts. And I think that's something that I strive to be better at. And so I appreciate you bringing that up, and
I love that,
and encouraging me in that.
Well, and even like when you are dating, right? I think it's important. I don't know what I've learned over the years with my wife is that, again, she wants me to lead, right? Early on, those first few years, I wasn't leading. She was leading. I didn't want to lead. I didn't understand how to. I didn't see the importance of it. But I think now, like, she wants me to lead. So for me to be able to go, and again, we don't do this perfectly, but we try to pray together every single night. We read the Bible together. We do devotions together. And so, but you can start doing that while you're dating, right? If you have to be able to get your marriage started off on the right foot, is to already have that established. To try to turn that 5 years down the road and change that is very difficult. So if you can start out doing that with whoever with your girlfriend, right? As you're courting and you're dating, you're trying to figure out if this is a good fit for marriage, is praying together, reading the Bible together, going to church together, talking about, asking her, hey, how's your walk going? How's your prayer life? How's what's God been teaching you, stuff like that. So I think you can start that now and just kind of build that foundation from the get-go.
Yeah, I'd like to be a good reminder of encouraging my future girlfriend and wife to, like, in that, and I want to be that, and that's a deep desire that I believe God has put on my heart, and that I would love to step into.
Yeah.
And so, whenever he's ready. And then another thing that we've talked about is, who is your Paul, Timothy, and Barnabas?
Yeah.
That is something that I never thought of before. I have plenty of mentors, and I have really great friends. You've met my friends, and I love my friends. They help me in my walk with Christ, and they keep me accountable and everything like that. But when you mentioned specifically who's your Paul, Timothy, and Barnabas, it honestly rocked my world. And I was listening to you talking about it, and I had to really realize I don't have some of these. And so I would love for you to share a little bit more with the audience of what you mean by when you say, who is your Paul, Timothy, and Barnabas?
Yeah. No, I thank you. It's I think first off, it's intentionality, right? You got to be intentional about these things, because we have these relationships in our life, right? We got brothers walking alongside of us, and but how many do we have that will call us out on our crap, right? The Apostle Paul, he traveled with Barnabas. Like Paul, he wrote majority of the New Testament. Like, he's someone that we all look up to, right? He traveled with Barnabas, right? The son of encouragement. He was his travel companion. He was his buddy. So I challenge people, think of who's your Barnabas. Who is that person in your life that walks alongside you, who is going to call you out when he sees you sinning, who is going to hold you accountable for that, whom you will hold nothing back from, right? I've got friends that hey, we'll pray together, we'll talk about things, talk about life, but we're not there, right? But I do have somebody that I go to and I meet with weekly, right? And we ask each other questions like, hey, how's your prayer life going, man? Hey, have you looked at pornography this week? Hey, that sin that you were struggling with, how's that going, right? and I will share everything with him because I know he's not going to judge me for it. I know he loves me. I know he wants to see me grow closer to God. And so I think it's so important that we have that Barnabas in our life. From there, the Apostle Paul was a mentor. He discipled Timothy, who was a young pastor. He helped him along the way. He's taking his experience and he's pouring into somebody else to help further their walk, right? So who's your Timothy? Who is somebody that is not as far along in their walk as you, right? That is maybe younger. They don't have to be younger, but someone who's not as far along in their walk as you. Who are you intentionally pouring into and helping to navigate, hey, what does it mean to walk with Christ, right? Paul always said, follow me as I follow Christ. He didn't say, hey, do what I do. I got this figured out. He's like, hey, I'm running towards the cross. Come with me. And so I think that's important too. Who is your Timothy? Who are you pouring into? And then Paul. Who's your Paul? Who is somebody that is your mentor? Who is doing one-on-one discipleship with you? Someone who's further along in their walk than you, that you can learn from, that you can go to for advice, for biblical counsel, and not someone that's just older than you, right? Make sure that there's someone that is, you see fruit in their life. You see God moving in their life. And, so who's your Paul? Who's your Barnabas? Who's your Timothy, right? And so, and then to be able to replicate that.
100%. Wow. Man. This entire episode has been so encouraging for me. And this has probably been one of my favorite ones that we've done because of just how much value is being shared from your life experience in marriage and just the wisdom that you've been pouring out for me to glean from. And I really appreciate it. And, it's unfortunate that we have to cut our time because,
I could talk to you all day. This is great.
I know, me too. This has been probably one of the longer episodes, which I'm really, really grateful for. And to everyone that's still listening and watching at this point, I really appreciate all of you. Yeah, and I hope that everyone who listened in and tuned into this episode, I hope y'all really did glean from this because this is so important, and these are lessons that I've been learning over the last couple months. And to hear someone talk about their marriage experience and how they've been walking throughout their marriage from someone who's actually in a marriage and is in a place where I want to be in the future, it's incredibly helpful for me, and it's incredibly beneficial for me to hear about your walk and what you've experienced and what the lessons that you've learned. And so it really helps equip me for preparing my heart, preparing myself for that future spouse. And so I really appreciate you coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And like I told you, I will leave the All in Husbands description in the description. Oh, what am I saying? The link in the description. And so that way everyone that's watching on YouTube can go check that out. And I hope that they can go and they can glean all from your content as well. But thank you again for coming on the show, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, of course. We got to do this again.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, perfect.
All right.
Sweet.